You know what's odd? An entire generation got the impression that they were special, then worked harder than they normally would, and somehow ended up being unable to afford the same lifestyle that seemed completely normal just one generation earlier. That's a psychology experiment nobody agreed to be part of. I'm talking about millennials, which are people born between 1981 and 1996. And before you roll your eyes, probably because you think you know what I want to say, just stay with me, because this gets uncomfortable in ways you probably haven't even thought about. Millennials became the first generation in modern American history who were expected to be worse off financially than the generation before them. The Pew Research Center confirmed this back in 2020, which means we've got an entire generation walking around with this strange psychological mix of success and disappointment in their heads every single day. Imagine being told your whole childhood that you could be anything you wanted to be, win any award you wanted, achieve anything you put your mind to, and then being dropped headfirst into a recession where the only prize you won was a master's degree that cost more than the house you grew up in. Yikes. The psychological term for this is cognitive dissonance, and millennials are basically swimming in it. By the way, cognitive dissonance is a psychology term for what happens when your beliefs and your reality don't match, and your brain feels uncomfortable because of it. But here's where it gets really interesting, because this goes way deeper than student loans and make more money advice. Psychologist Jean Twenge literally wrote a book called Generation Me, studying this exact phenomenon. She found out that millennials score higher on narcissism scales than the previous generations. But, and this is the part that'll mess with you, they also score higher on anxiety and depression than previous generations. Interesting, right? So, you've got a generation that was raised to feel exceptional, but now walks around feeling invisible. A trauma response dressed up as a resume. Think about the actual timeline here for a second. Millennials were the test subjects for every parenting trend that came out of the self-esteem movement in the 80s and 90s. Helicopter parents, participation trophies, being told you were brilliant just for showing up. These weren't bad intentions. They were sincere attempts at better parenting based on the psychology that was available at the time. Things were going good until millennials hit their 20s, right as the economy imploded in 2008. They proceeded to graduate into a job market that had fundamentally changed, and suddenly found themselves navigating a completely different economic reality than the one they'd been prepared for. That sudden shift alone qualifies as a psychological trauma. And what about social media? Millennials got that right in their formative years, not the way Gen Z kids got it, but they got it as teenagers and young adults when their identities were still forming. Facebook launched in 2004 and Instagram in 2010. That means millennials were learning how to be adults while building a personal brand they never asked for. Dr. Tim Kasser's research on materialism and well-being shows that when people base their self-worth on external validation, which is literally what social media trains you to do, their mental health suffers. You're essentially running a 24/7 PR campaign for your own life, and the feedback never stops. Now remember that on top of dealing with this, the millennials are completely skipping the traditional life milestones that used to give generations before them a sense of adult identity. Things like marriage, building a career, owning a home, having kids. Surveys show they absolutely desire these things, but the economic reality that they face makes achieving these things borderline impossible without inheriting family wealth or having extraordinary luck. So, you've got people in their late 20s all the way to their early 40s who still feel like they're waiting for their real life to start, except they are having to wait in a studio apartment that costs around $2,000, and their therapist is booked until Christmas. The impact of this prolonged uncertainty is surprisingly well documented. When the thing society says you're supposed to have at a certain age starts feeling out of reach, your brain doesn't just brush it off and move on. No. Instead, it creates this low-level stress that's referred to as allostatic load, which is your body's tendency to prepare for something that never actually comes. It's like your life is frozen on loading, while everyone else seems to be moving forward. And when you look at the progress bar, you see it hasn't moved an inch in the past decade. But let me tell you something that might feel uncomfortably familiar. Millennials were sold a very specific story about how effort equals outcome. Go to school, study hard, go to college, get a good job, work your way up, excel. That social contract seemed pretty straightforward, and honestly, it had worked for a long time for generations before. Except the economic landscape shifted in ways that nobody really anticipated. When millennials showed up ready to follow that path, they found that college now costs 20 times what it used to. Entry-level jobs require 3 years of experience, and then they slapped you with $80,000 in debt and a be-your-own-boss job that comes with zero safety net. Psychologists actually have a name for what happens when real life completely breaks the rules you thought the world followed. It's called schema disruption, and when it happens on a generational scale like it did with the millennials, you don't just get a bunch of disappointed people. You get a complete rewiring of how an entire age group relates to institutions, society, authority, and the concept of a stable future. This explains why millennials are often characterized as hopeful and deeply skeptical at the same time. They still believe things should be fair, they just no longer believe they will be. This is pattern recognition in action. And let's not even start with the job hopping thing. These days, millennials get absolutely roasted for not being loyal to companies that employ them. But you know what's psychologically fascinating about that criticism? It is misdirected. Corporate America fundamentally changed the employment relationship over the past few decades. Pensions have disappeared. Full-time positions have become contract work. Mass layoffs have become almost a common business strategy. It wasn't millennials that invented this lack of loyalty, so don't blame them. They just adapted to an employment landscape that had already changed. So theirs was just a completely rational response to an environment that treats workers as disposable. However, this is something that's not talked about enough. Millennials are also one of the most educated and most diverse generations in history. They grew up with the internet, which creates a very specific psychological profile, one that questions everything, because they've seen multiple versions of truth depending on who's telling the story. People who question the system often get called entitled or difficult. But that's what critical thinking looks like when it runs into rules that were never meant to be challenged. Even the mental health conversation is different for millennials. They're the first generation to widely destigmatize therapy and talk about anxiety and depression like real things, instead of seeing them as character flaws. That's massive, especially since they're doing it while living in conditions that are objectively more stressful than previous generations, with student debt amounts that would have been unthinkable before, housing costs that have grown larger than wages, and job insecurity that is now blended into the economy. So, not surprisingly, it creates this strange situation where they're very self-aware and completely exhausted at the same time. If you are still watching, I guess you are invested in this topic. So, at this point, let's shift our attention to the future for a bit. Because millennials are also the generation that gets to watch the planet actively deteriorate while being told they're the ones who need to fix it, despite having less power and fewer resources to actually do anything about it. Constant anxiety about the future, plus the feeling of being powerless, climate anxiety is now a legitimate psychological phenomenon, and millennials are right in the middle of it. So what you've got is a generation raised on huge expectations, hit with an unstable economy, non-stop pressure, delayed adulthood, and a front row seat to crisis after crisis. And society looks at them and goes, "Why are you so stressed? And why can't you just buy a house already?" However, the psychology of millennials becomes incredibly predictable when you look at what they've been through. Think about it. They're responding exactly how humans respond when the ground shifts under their feet and the directions they were given suddenly stops working. You'd probably feel the same way if you were in their shoes. If this hit home for you and you want to support these deep dives, hit that like and subscribe button. Also, leave a comment if you can. I genuinely appreciate your support.